Evolutionary astrology, we will look at the planet ruling a sign and archetype as being one interchangeable archetype. There's 12 archetypes in the zodiac. Mercury and Venus both ruling 2 signs, 2 houses. And so when you can break that down into those 12 archetypes and learn them, then you can extrapolate it out to a planet or a sign or a house. And when we are learning the beginnings of an archetype, and we divide the circle by 2, we have polarities. When we divide the circle of 12 by 3, we have modalities. When we divide the circle of 12 by 4, we have elements. And by the way, if you are a real beginner, we did do a series on this, which you can find on our website under educational webinars. So we can see that Jupiter is active polarity, mutable modality, and the element of fire. As it moves into Scorpio, we're going to be working through a passive polarity, a fixed modality, and a water element. Nothing matches up. Everything is different. If we look at the polarities, active and passive, there's only 2. So it creates that back and forth energy. The passive energy of Scorpio is going to want to slow down any Jupiter expansions for security reasons. The active polarity of Jupiter is going to build up pressure to be released. With the modalities, the mutable modality is going to want to make changes faster than that fixed energy of Scorpio. And so the compromise is that change must make sense. Water is always senses. And it must feel secure. Water needs a container before taking action. So just the basics of recognizing as I am growing and evolving over the next year, it's going to have an emotional flavor for it. And I'm going to be feeling my way through. I'm going to be working with my senses a lot more than trying to make it be okay before I move into it. We'll watch how this can really build up pressure for Jupiter, Scorpio with this fixed modality as we go through some of these slides. And then when we get to the element, we have fire and water. Well, we know what happens here. Water puts out the fire, and fire heats water and creates steam, and it boils over. And so there has to be compromises between these 2 elements of water and fire so that both can have a chance to act, to be, to evolve. Jupiter evolution. So it will sometimes require courage to make changes and do something new. Fire is that sense of special destiny. It's spirit. It's the spark. And when we have that fixed water of Scorpio, passive fixed water of Scorpio, this is a Scorpio word as well as a few other archetypes, but we have to have courage and will to the depth of our soul and moving forward. So if you're a beginner to astrology in general, you can take all 12 archetypes and you can break them down to their polarities, modalities, and elements. And this will really help you then understand how any single archetype will work, how they blend together. Jupiter in Scorpio. Scorpio and its 8th house, and both ruled by Pluto, represents the soul, that immutable consciousness, unconsciousness that exists from lifetime to lifetime beyond the body. And so this archetype represents the soul on both an individual and a collective level. And within the soul, there is what evolutionary astrology calls the dual desire nature. We have first a desire to separate from that which created us, or the desire to incarnate into a physical body if we're human or animal or even plant. Now, what's that separating desire? In natural law, this is anything and everything. Desire to have a new job, a new lover, to have clothing and resources and a car and a place to live, and all of these things that we can sometimes be made to feel guilty about when we have them in excess. And also, though, in natural law, is that every soul goes through countless lifetimes exhausting the separating desire nature. And this is different. This contrasts with what religions teach. Religions teach that false belief that we can somehow pray ourselves perfect. We can deny that desire for sexuality unless it's procreating. We can, pretend that we don't need this or we don't need that, and then wonder why it becomes this secret obsession in our life. And then all of a sudden the secret of it is exposed and it's put out there for all to see. Again, this is the distortions of many religions that deny that there's any senses below the neck. And as we learn to recognize that these separating desires is the path that we take to evolve and exhaust the desires, it doesn't give us carte blanche to go out and do anything and everything, but it does help us understand why we're here, why we have this desire to have a long-term intimate partner if we've not been successful with that yet. And so letting go of a lot of the judgments around these separating desires and just go, this is something that's really important to me. My soul desires it. I will create this. And as time goes by, we have the desire, we create it, we exhaust it, we replace it with another desire, create it, exhaust it. And eventually it starts to become that, been there, done that. Isn't there something else to all of this? And so this is when the other opposite desire comes in, the desire to return to that which created us, or the desire to know universal source, God, Goddess, Great Spirit, the big kahuna, whatever you want to call it. There really is only one returning desire, and that is to know source. And in natural law, these two desires interplay with each other. This is going to be a real expansion of understanding with Jupiter and Scorpio. Just think about it. How many of you who participate in this webinar want to know source, want to lead a spiritual life, want to have some spiritual practices in your world, but you're not sitting off on a Himalayan mountaintop. You're in the world. You are having to go to your job to have money to eat. And so it's recognizing that interplay. And as the returning desire becomes stronger and stronger, we realize that these separating desires are still things that we fulfill and exhaust, but they're not the be-all, end-all substitute for source anymore. They're just the mechanism of moving through and evolving on our spiritualization path. For instance, Scorpio, which is the archetype of merging sexuality with another. In natural law, the last separating desire that we exhaust is sexuality. Only 1 to 2% of souls on the planet have naturally exhausted the desire for sex. A, procreation of the species, survival of the species. And then B, it is the last thing to let go of that, again, can actually get us here. And so trying to then pretend via religion that, deny sexuality, a religion forcing its, spiritual leaders to be celibate, well, look at how that's worked out in a few religions. If we suppress something that's natural, it gets distorted and it comes back at us in distorted ways. And so spiritual principles that embrace sexuality, even to the point of sacred sexuality, as sexuality as a means to spiritualize, to form that sacred union, merging with another one-on-one, is that path of merging with Source. So Jupiter in Scorpio is going to expose all of these deep dual desires within us. We may release some, we may have some new separating desires come through, we may have that returning desire strengthening and becoming more and more conscious through Jupiter in Scorpio. Jupiter in Scorpio is where we are going to be facing some of our greatest emotional fears. Water is emotions, element of water. And reaching for deeper levels of self-reliance, that Taurus polarity of Scorpio, and reaching for these deeper levels of self-reliance through realigning with a greater source of power. And this greater source of power may be of a separating or returning nature. As I said, for some of us, we may have a deepening of that desire to know Source. However, just like we have dual desires, separating desires, returning desires, there are larger forces in the universe that exist outside of ourselves that we will call the separating and returning forces. Here's how EA explains it. When we had the Big Bang 14 billion years ago, when the unmanifested manifested itself in a desire to evolve itself, the first law that came into being 14 billion years ago was the law of polarity. Manifest, unmanifest, separate, return. And when that law came into being, so did separating and returning forces, what religion would call evil and good. I like to use the separating, returning labels because so many of us can have stigmas and fears, Scorpio, just around the term good and evil. So what we can then do as we want to merge with a greater source of power, sometimes it's not the returning forces. Sometimes we will merge with a separating force. Again, separating forces are always going to be intent on tripping us up in returning back to universal source. They're going to be tripping us up in trying to have that separating desire be a substitute for source. And this can be really extorted to extremes.